We see sort of similar processes in like movement language where like grief, mutual aid, abolition gets co-opted and commodified. How do you hold on to, again, that political clarity when survival work gets packaged and sold back to us, just as an organizer and in your discussions on the podcast?
Yeah, I think it's that point of consistency. Because we're gonna consistently get bullshit thrown at us, and I think people, and also moving at the speed of trust. And this is what I think like the real beauty in just like working with your neighbors and neighborhood associations, or just having a meeting at the library and inviting all your friends that live with you and all the people down the street to it. You're also a point of contact and a point of information, and everyone moves at the speed of trust, whether that's like false or not, however it's earned. And I think being a consistent voice for another narrative is what keeps something alive and allows it
Mhm.
to develop, to like actually be something that reaches people and actually come from a place of mutual respect and mutual relationships.
Mhm.
It's kind of this point of me where I'm like, if you can't talk to politics with your neighbor or with your coworker, you need to iron out your politics a bit. You need to battle test your politics a bit with just real conversation with people. Because people have other concerns to not think about what somebody who's chronically online or chronically political thinks about.
What's interesting about your background is your work has been rooted in harm, care, and survival rather than clean sort of aesthetics of politics. And when you talk about that kind of underground work, it reminds me of Ashanti Alston, and you just like referred to earlier in the conversation, which was the prefigurative space where we live freedom before it's recognized. What does that space look like for you, and what sustains it?
For me, I mean, there's a lot to be done, but what sustains it, so there's a lot to be done. I've been thinking about this question specifically a lot, but because I have spent the past couple years kind of divorcing myself from different political formations to make space to analyze a bit more and to make space to educate and train and study.
Which is
That
an
being said,
important phase to go through as an organizer.
yeah, I think it's very important. To me, I'm obsessed with bringing back the anarchist labor and economic tradition, because I feel like
Mhm.
it's what brings one. It's something consistent. You can bring material change from material grievances that people have, and two, I think that it helps us break down these conversations of like, to me, what kind of world we want to live in. A lot of radical folks, when they think of changing the world, maybe they're still thinking of like some centralized state that's doing economics. And to me, that's not my goal. My goal is a very fragmented and decentralized economy. And in doing that, that means like building associations of co-ops, of communes, and kind of looking back to that tradition of like what started like the USSR, and in Venezuela and in China, and these communes and these collective units, like economic units. And to me, that means like I eventually want to live in the world where we have all of our resources, we have a way to distribute that equitably, and people can still produce. People can still make artisan bread if they want and give it to people and sell it or whatever. People can still like plan weddings and do all this. Like I think like what is this kind of societal infrastructure that is less centralized around the state, or giving the state more power versus creating more autonomous political institutions and associations that may be state funded because that's our money, but not state ran. So like thinking about the different ways that we can like socialize those sorts of things into that, it's how do you then collectively manage resources, which is what I think that everyone could be doing and bringing into any organization they're in now, which is like what sort of organizational frameworks, decision making processes, roles, leaderships, recallability, different things that we're working in to make a more self managed and voluntary society. And here locally, we have like the Cooperation Jackson, the Network for Land and Liberation, and like trying to look and model themselves more off like the MST down in Brazil that like occupy land, take it, and still fight the government, but have the overall goal of revolution, but have the right now goal of sustaining a populace and actually building some sort of like communal network that people are accountable to. And to me, that's a nationalism without the state. That's a communal political project that we can work for that's outside of the current structures.
That's really interesting. And I think it comes back, if prefigurative spaces is about living freedom before it's recognized, then Kwasi Balagoons reminds us that it also takes discipline and strategy, not just desire to imagine or to live anarchism. And in your own work, what does that sort of readiness look like when things get messy, and what would you recommend to other organizers or people who are thinking about anarchism?
To me, the best thing to stay prepared is to be organized. It's what I've seen like through history. Even like, that's why like everybody's favorite militant formations comes out of a not so militant formation. And I think that's because one, there needs to be a space for like to actually prepare for those conversations to happen. And in that space, one, dissent will always form, but I think in preparing around it, it's about having as many relationships to build off of that when things get really messy, there's some sort of knowledge, of trust that you can lean on. And I don't know, I always think it's really interesting when you're always hearing the anarchists just say like, get organized. Because I've always been called someone who's like a destructuralist or something like that. And I'm very much into how the structures work. And I feel like that's what actually drives me to anarchism, is that study of like the velocity of power or how things like are managed in a space. And yeah, I just think that in preparing for things to get messy, like trying and experimenting things when you feel like they're all right. Because I find a lot of inspiration from the comrades in Rojava and in Syria who were doing the local councils and doing that sort of organizing in wartime. And I think if we have the luxury and the same politics, we should be trying everything that we can to do that while we're not in the militant hot phase. And that might just mean like stocking up on things. And I think like there is like a small prepper anarchist space. And I think the best way to talk about to like stock up on items is to talk about like what you actually need. What is a real risk assessment? What are the actual like possible harms that could happen to your community? What are the things that are consistent? And or maybe that looks like what kind of labor is needed. Because I mean, the people who do most of the medicing, who do like a lot of the support work for protests that aren't always a part of the organization putting it on, are usually just autonomists or anarchists that have knowledge and have organized themselves in that capacity. And I think that's like the space for it to grow.
Like seeing who's being targeted and why. You've also said that capitalism doesn't just exploit, it disappears, it kills, it isolates. What does racial capitalism mean to you when it shows up in housing, policing, and even the language of solidarity?
To me, I guess when I think of like capitalism and racial capitalism, because to me they're one and the same. They're just like, it's like having to, I don't know, I guess it brings that Afro-pessimist point to me. I guess also to that end, it brings at that point that all capitalism is racial in that point, and like the exact severity or the different ways that is approached is very local, like approach from the authorities in the region because of like capital's necessity to be regulated by the state. I mean, humans, we wouldn't accept capitalism if it wasn't regulated. And I think to me that brings out like a take of mine that I've had for a while from researching like different international things, which is like it brings into the conversation of caste into the conversation, especially when we're talking about America or talking about anywhere where capitalism touches. Even when you look at colonial structures, even early in the beginning, they've always been built on exploiting different hierarchies that they see in a society, whether on purpose or happy accidents. Whatever makes that line go up, which is more exploitation, they're gonna do. And to me, it brings in that demanding of like, especially when we're talking about who has land in America, who has land, who doesn't, who is going to be hit with the most predatory debts. And we can say that it's not necessarily racial, but when you look at how like the history of the United States, economic disenfranchisement, that it is very based on a very purposeful caste system inside of the US that I think it doesn't really get talked about like that as much, because I just don't think that language is in the United States as much. And also because the caste system here is very informal compared to other places. But But yeah, those are the first things that really come to my mind.
That's a really unique analysis. And there's a recent post the Dugout shared critiquing the performance of the protest, how doing a protest becomes a substitute for building power. What does that performance cost us when people are still being disappeared and ICE is hiring more agents and neighborhoods are still under siege?
Yeah, I mean, there's the opportunity cost of not building power in that moment. I mean, mobilizing is great, but mobilizing can be great, but it's one tool in a tool set, and it can help build power. It can help people feel powerful, which is important to building power. Because you get to wherever you're demonstrating and there's an extra 100 people there, 200, 300, you're going to feel a little something. You're going to feel a little sure of yourself a bit more, have that communal backing. But what builds actual power is having a structure to organize each individual will for each person to be able to make a collective fist. 'Cause I mean, it takes a couple fingers to make a fist, and that's kind of what we need. And in that, I also think one thing that's lost is legibility. Because if people just see you outside and nothing's happening, then they're just going to think you're just there to be there, which I think is also like a media problem. People not doing their own media, not knowing how and what to post based on operational security. Because there is beautiful, beautiful rapid response work happening all over Turtle Island right now against ICE, but a lot of that will not become unearthed to people who aren't organizers for years. And that to me is depressing. Having different ways to talk about the actual resistance that's going on. I mean, which is where some different or websites like a noblogs.com or other things are, but those aren't really accessible to the masses or the public as much. So we only really get to hear about stuff like that when ICE is like, we've had up to 700% in attacks. We don't have the media apparatus to also tell folks, well, they consider you following them for an hour on 270, a highway, to be an assault. When they had to get out of their car and come harass you and then they left, they considered that an assault. And yeah.
And I think that bridges into another question. You've talked a lot about neighborhood defense, not as like, just like a slogan or anything, but as a strategy, as a tactic. What is the importance of building neighborhood defense in terms of security culture and, the sort of vicious landscape that we're in the US and other places? And what inspires you on that front?
Yeah. I mean, I'll start with what inspires me, which is it's something that's consistent in every like revolution. You have to have land-based organizing. And the best way to do that, in my opinion, especially if you don't own land or not operating on like having large sects of communal land, is working with those around you in your neighborhood. I think also that's where, to me, mutual aid is actually mutual. There's like this large setup of serving what's not charity, but is like directly aiding people around you that a lot of radicals have been doing, especially over the past 5 years, but creating systems that are actually mutual, that are able to be impacted and impactful by and to people who are using it and who are a part of a network. Because to me, mutual aid is a way to describe a network, specifically one with like material or economic impact that decreases one's subsistency off a capitalist economy and one more based off a solidarity-based economy. And I feel like it has a lot more material points of access. Actually drive people, because you're much more willing to do something if you're also organizing yourself and not just trying to organize others. It keeps your drive and commitment to a project.
Anger is often coded as unstrategic, but in your work, rage feels like something that's quite useful. And how do you see rage operating in Black anarchist traditions, not just as emotion, but as method?
I think I see it. I mean, one, it's beautiful because you can't, in my opinion, respect the love of something without also respecting the rage. Love never sits alone. Rage never sits alone. Everything comes in a context. And I think that, especially from the Black tradition or of any oppressed folks, that a lot of times they're so intertwined, and that one's love for something makes you rageful, and one's rage for something, rage either against an injustice, guides you to create new structures and new institutions. I think that Yeah, I mean, that's definitely, I think it's the rage that keeps you in, it's the anger and the love and the inconsistency of the world that makes you want to make something consistent. And yeah, I don't know if I have too much more to speak on that.
Yeah. So, yeah, you've also talked about loneliness on the podcast. When you know what you're seeing, but everyone else is chasing sort of like, you know, the easy, instant sort of gratification or aesthetics. What has sustained you in those moments of political alienation?
Knowing that when I was in that phase, that when I was in my mobilize, 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 that's how we organize phase, that there were other people creating like infrastructure, like movement infrastructure for when I was ready for it. And I know there are some people still doing that now, and I'm in more community with them. And I know that it's a phase or a moment that doesn't or shouldn't last forever. And part of what brings me the joy now is when you stay dedicated, consistent with something and surrounding folks and people that you can be accountable to and move with, that you like watching it grow and watching the impact on other people, as much as reflecting on that impact within myself of having different political formations and different political communities in my life and wanting to give that to others. I feel like is kind of what keeps me going.